G'day, brothers and sisters. This is the other Paul, and Geoff just came in clutch. Literally, as soon as I started the intro, he wasn't even in, so he didn't even say hi yet. But now he's here. So hello to you, Geoff, as well.
All right. I just went swimming at my swim club. You can see how bald I am.
I can see that. Look, I thought you got an electric shock for a second there.
It's mainly due to my medicine that I'm bald. I swear. It's not my age. And then I didn't even walk the dog around the block.
How dare you? What a sin. That's a big time sin.
Well, I fed the dog. She's a Labrador, so she.
Good.
Let me. You give me 30 seconds. You do whatever you do. I'm gonna go get my hat. So
no problem.
Oh, how you doing? You want to say hi to the world? You want to say hi to the world? No. Okay. All right.
All right. See you in 30. All right. So. Fam, good to see you all here. Angelica, good to see you. E Cinque, hello to you. Atheist Coping, There Is No God. Absolutely beautiful name. Your parents made an excellent choice with it. Lovely to see you. Afternoon Shift Stream, let's flip and go, mate. Author Chog, lovely to see you as well. And Someone the Person, likewise, good to see you too. And everybody else watching, please make yourself known in the chat. We are a very wholesome community here. And whilst Geoff's doing his thing, and he is back already, but before we begin, I'm going to really quickly thank my financial supporters. You legends are, well, just that, absolute legends. Everyone here who is supporting me, thank you so much. And if anyone is considering that, now is actually the best time to do it, because originally with Subscribestar, it was that you would subscribe and you would only be charged every interval on the first of the month. So theoretically, someone could subscribe like on the second of the month and just have an entire free month, and then go and then only be charged in the first of the next month. And unfortunately, my Jewish self did not like that. Just kidding, that's not it. I want to avoid the potential abuse, which no one has done, thank God. But the potential for someone to just simply go get benefits for a whole month and then just unsubscribe. But also because of potential issues with like payment errors that people have gotten. A couple of people have actually gotten that recently. And so for that reason and to prevent potential abuse, I've made it so that I've changed it so that as soon as someone subscribes, they will immediately pay for that month. And then the first of every month following, they will then pay. And because it's the very beginning of the month now, if you're considering supporting, now is actually the best time. So you can get so that you have a minimal interval between the first payment and your next first of the month payment, because it'll basically be a 4 month if you go right now. So nice plug there. Anyway, for those who are supporting right now, thank you so much. You make this possible. You are slowly but surely turning this into a side job for me. Higher quality equipment, software, all that jazz. Thank you all so much. You are absolute legends. Anyway.
Are you mixing Latin and Greek there?
Yes. Well, no, not Greek. Not Greek. It's just Latin. Well, actually, no. I actually kind of am. So I'm doing... So I'm doing transliterated Greek for the rank, rather than their Latin equivalents. But then the actual title of the thing itself, the census patronorum, the census of patrons, that's Latin. So that is actually kind of sinful now that I think about it. But I think I might keep it that way.
Hey, Porks.
Well, hello there.
Hey,
hello there.
What are you doing?
What's this dude doing?
Oh, he's being a cat. There's some historian I follow on YouTube, and he just like every once in a while his cat like walks into the frame, into the camera. You saw the cat's butthole one time, as cats are wont to do.
Ruh-roh raggy. Ruh-roh raggy. Oh man, Dalton, lovely to see you. Matt Bell, my faithful mod, lovely to see you. Ribbiter Rabbit, very good to see you too. Goy for Paul, he should be called. I like that name. I very much like. Actually, I wouldn't even be the Goy. I'd be.
Hey, how's your Hebrew, Paul? Can you read my hat?
What does that say? It's without the vowels. That's kind of the problem for me. Payaline or something? Payaline? I don't know.
It's the Philadelphia Phillies. So Feline or something like that.
Okay, I thought, you know, I kind of suspected that. I suspected it was some kind of football team thing or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Very close enough. Someone the person. What's your tea, Paul? So my tea is Twinings Assam Bold. So it's a very nice. I think it's an Indian brand of tea. I think well Twinings is English, but I think Assam Bold is specifically an Indian or an Arabian type of tea. I'm not exactly sure.
Never mind. I saw a clip online of an Indian, or like her heritage is Indian. I don't know if she's Indian. Like she sounds American, so I don't know if she's first or second or third generation or whatever. But she was like, her joke was she was dating a British guy, and she wasn't sure if he was interested in me or my spices and trade routes. I like that.
You can't be too. You can't be certain with those ones.
Yeah, can't be certain with the British.
Oh man, Chivery, lovely to see you, my man. Happy to have you here. Edwin Hearn, hello there, my favorite heretic. Why, likewise to you, one of my favorite Romanist friends. Sword of Oregon, likewise. Andrew Bailey, lovely, fantastic to see you as usual. Jace Raider, good to see you. Pope Paul's the best Pope. Cope, seethe, and dilate Romanists. Now, I assume you mean dilate pupils with that, so I'm gonna assume you mean that. So let's hope so. Someone the person based, indeed. Anyway, if it wasn't clear already, today's collab, the dynamic. That's such a cringe like cliche. The dynamic duo, but basically the agents of chaos. Me and Geoff here, our latest.
Well, we got to get an intro.
That's it. You gave
like Mr. Wolf being called like from Pulp Fiction. Like what? Jesuits are at it again. All right, it's time to roll.
Maybe we should do something like that. I don't know. I'm still kind of thinking of what to do. That will be funny if we just have our own dedicated intro, because we really are our own thing on our respective channels. Me and you, like it's fantastic. It's a great relationship.
Yeah.
Indig, lovely to see you too, and thank you for supporting. Listening as I doze off. Keep it ASMR. Lol. I hope that helps you sleeping, brother. Thank you. Matt Bell, Brothers in Arms, already taken. Indeed, it is. Anyway, if it wasn't already clear, we are responding to a certain video on Trent Horn's channel, but with him and Sonna, where this is actually really unexpected. I genuinely did not see this coming.
It was like, when you sent the link to me, I was like pretty shocked. Now, first of all, I just wanted to say, Trent, if you're listening, I appreciated the kind words you had for me and Steve Christie on Matt Horn's channel. Well, I guess when they were talking about the errors in the Apocrypha and all the back and forth we had there. He couldn't remember my personal name, which I don't care, but that's fine. And then, Suan, we did like 6 hours of responses to Suan on my channel, and then he came on your channel, and we had like 2 hours or so with him back, or an hour and a half, something like that.
Great.
So these are probably our two favorite Catholic apologists. They're both really nice guys, both smart.
Yeah.
Both fair, I think. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so.
They're not, even if we disagree with them, they're not making like egregious errors most of the time, or they at least try to. I noticed this with Trent a lot. Not that this is a flaw of Suan, but the Trent it does a very good job of like nuancing the other side and not.
Steel manning.
Yeah, steel manning. Yeah.
He does do a good job with that, indeed. And I'm still always genuinely impressed with Swan's, basically his mega bibliographies he brings to virtually every one of his presentations. That's pretty cool. Does make good reading. Does inspire me whenever I see his stuff. Whenever I want to see something, I'm like, ooh, what's that reference? I want to go check that out myself and all that. So it is very, very interesting that way. I really, really do like it. Although, of course, I still have the criticism where I wish he had much more higher ratio of primary sources than secondary sources. But whatever. It's still cool in and of itself that he cites a lot of stuff. But yeah, as I was saying, we were genuinely surprised they came out with this video, because what it's responding to is a certain article on the Protestant. It deals with many other issues other than Protestantism and Catholicism, but otherwise very firmly Protestant blog Triablogue.
They have a lot of posts, and so back when Steve Hayes, Steve Hayes.
How do you figure that?
I was like, make sure I don't say Christie because he's our friend too. Another cat. So anyway, they have a lot. Their archives are awesome. Like, so I've been reading them for years. And Jason was it? I'm going to butcher his last name. I've never heard it pronounced.
Yeah, I think it's. I just say Angwer.
Angwer, yeah.
Yeah.
Who we invited, but he declined to come on YouTube. Because it's not his being live is not his thing. So over a decade ago, a long time ago,
close to the original one. So I'm reading the original article. In fact, I'll share it right now. So just to contextualize for everyone, why we're surprised that this is the article that Suan, Sonna, and Trent are responding to. And we're surprised because the blog itself is already pretty niche. Like, it goes a long way back in basically the ancient original days of online Christian dialogue and debating and all that stuff. And it's pretty niche. It's not like on the huge pop level. But I was blessed to have known and read through them, especially during my stages of near apostasy, because their stuff is just very top quality. And for a long time, I've known of this article, and Geoff's known of it as well. This absolute classic article on it called 51 Biblical Proofs of a Pauline Papacy and Ephesian Primacy, which is basically trying to parody an earlier post of a Catholic apologist list of 50, as he says here, another Catholic apologist list of 50 alleged biblical proofs for Petrine papacy. And so if you notice here, so the post itself was published in 2012. So August 4th, 2012. So it's coming up on 10 years in 2 days. Wow. That's insane. 2 or 3 days, depending on our time zone. This article is coming up on exactly 10 years old. That's insane. That's pretty awesome.
So by internet standards, this is like, hey, let's review this film from 1917.
This is like, for the internet, this is like, this is like the Ignatius of Antioch of the internet. That's how ancient we're talking with respect to but if you notice in the very beginning of the article as well, he says already that at the time of posting, this was something he wrote almost a decade ago. So already at the time of this article's posting, it was almost a decade old. So this list...
So he probably wrote it in some bulletin board somewhere or something.
Yeah. I think he said Facebook. Actually, no, it wouldn't be Facebook. It's not a decade old. I just thought he said Facebook somewhere. But so this is almost 20 years old, technically, this list of proof texts, and thus the core of the article. But otherwise... because of its nicheness, the nicheness of the blog and of the article itself, even though like amongst us who know of it, it's quite a classic, genuinely surprised to have seen, we were both genuinely surprised to have seen Suan, Sonna, and Trent, men of their popularity and fame in the online realms, to respond specifically to this article. So that was a genuine surprise, and we just had to take it up. We just had to watch it, and I just had to schedule in a response to it and invite Geoff along. Because this is our homeboy here, Jason, and one of our favorite blogs we follow. So yeah, just had to do it. Genuinely surprising it came up.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of. It's not like devoted to Catholic issues, although it has a ton of articles in that topic.
Yep.
And our friend John Begay used to write for them, so you'll see articles from him, comments. Stuff like that. So
that's it.
So anyway,
yeah, and it's a great article. I've linked it below in the description if you guys want to check it out. It's a classic. It's just a comedy classic. Just because of the nature of it, it's a parody showing proof texts for a Pauline papacy. So if you read through almost any of these examples, if you've been involved with dialogue with Roman Catholics and apologists and scholars and that, you may get the echo in your head for certain Petrine proof text arguments you get as you read this. So like, what's a good example? Paul is the only apostle who refers to his authority over all the churches, 1 Corinthians 4:17, 7:17, and so on. And so like that kind of thing where they point to something uniquely said about Peter, therefore primacy, therefore supremacy, neglecting to consider the possibility that saying something only to someone does not mean that the same was not given to others and all that, for example. So it's kind of a bit of a leap to just say specifically him, therefore only him. But either way, just read through the whole thing. Classic article, absolutely classic. And we're both friends with Jason, so I actually told him of this response as soon as it came out, and as a result, he actually posted his own moderately length response to it as well on Triablogue, one of their latest posts. So that's also linked below if people want to see it. So he's informed, he's responded to it, and now we're going to be doing our own one, which is going to be fairly thorough.
Yeah. So it's the response is kind of weird, because it kind of like took this more seriously and didn't really get the point of this article, or at least the point I took away from it. I'm not sure what Jason intentionally meant, but the way I take this is that I'm not saying consciously, but especially over the years and the centuries, they've been Catholics have been raping the scriptures, looking for looking for things that any hint. It's kind of like what Muslims do when they for Muhammad in scripture.
Where did Jesus say, "I am God"? Worship?
No. But the paraclete or whatever
the paraclete. Did you say the paraclete?
Yeah, it's early in the morning for me. Yeah, I shouldn't even. Please forgive me for my crap pronunciation. I'm just doing off the top of my head. But that was, or like this in Isaiah is Muhammad or something like that.
Yeah,
it's not as bad as that, but that's kind of what I think has happened. So. It's just to kind of give an example. I've been thinking about this the last few weeks because we normally like to say, Protestants over the years have pointed out, Protestants have pointed out what, in Galatians, right? Paul rebukes Peter. As kind of a response to these type of Catholic arguments.
Yep.
Well, and Catholics will rightly say, well, that doesn't really show blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. But could you have imagined if it was the other way around? If Peter rebuked Paul for hundreds of years? Can you tell me someone in 1300 wouldn't have used that for Petrine primacy? So for me, I think it shows there's a lot of double standards in this, where they're just kind of on a mission. I think a lot of this happens with Marian stuff as well, where the scriptures get abused like a redheaded stepchild. So,
bro, with the bangers out here.
They do. It's just like, well, where are you getting this? I can imagine, like, say, from an Orthodox Jewish perspective, this is how they feel when we go to the Old Testament and they're like, where are you getting Jesus from this? So the question is, like, can you actually defend it? But I think a fair thing to ask is, if you're consistent in your methodology, how can you say, see Peter and not Paul? If you don't come in with an a priori assumption that Peter is the Pope, right? Because I'm going to tell you what I think happened in history. All right, not that I have like complete proof, but I think this is what happened in history. Rome was the only major city in the Western Roman Empire. Okay, so nothing like a papacy was going to develop in the East because there was too many counterbalances. They still had an emperor, that sort of thing. Yep. So once the Roman Empire, so the papacy was kind of like the main seat of power in the whole of the Western Roman Empire, especially spiritually. And they were kind of the only major city for a good chunk of years. So I think their power developed, and then they kind of ex post facto kind of came up with justifications. Yeah. And so when we see these proofs, quote unquote, I think we should view it. That's how I view what happened, is that it's not like real. It's not like, oh, we saw the risen Christ and then we started to understand the Old Testament.
What up, Steve? What up? What up? But yes, that is so true. So true how you mentioned that. That is basically how it is. It does make sense because you even see it with the Great Schism doco that I made for Craig Trulli, which people, if you haven't watched already, go to his channel. It's really, really cool. He'll even talk about how like Rome's jurisdiction in the, well, at least in the latter parts of the early church, was considered to be over the entire West because that was basically all the preaching jurisdiction of Peter and Paul. And so Rome just had this massive authority just over such a massive part of the world that it does make sense that they eventually start to get a little big for their boots, get a little bit of hubris.
Think of Jason's article here as like alternative history.
Yeah.
All right. Think of it as it's about Paul. Like, what if Peter never visited Rome? It was just Paul who visited Rome, and then Rome wanted to make her claims based on Paul. What kind of arguments would start showing up? Using the same methodology they used to prove Peter.
Yeah.
Like, would they make these type of arguments? And I think they would have. Now, granted, I can't prove that. And again, I think a lot of it is, to me, like what I say is, hey, I don't see the papacy in early church history. So
that's it.
It's just that's really the actual defeater.
It's a real, that's it. This is just kind of picking at their methodology. They could theoretically try to find like actual direct text, which some of them would argue like Matthew 16 is a direct text, not merely like a proof text. But obviously, that's the very thing we're challenging. But yeah, we're gonna. It's pretty humble. The article, what it's trying to show. And I did chat with Jason a little bit about it, and something key about the article, which will be important for our response to Suan and Trent, which we're going to get to. We're going to get to right after this because we've been in here for a bit. Actually, I'll mention it when it's relevant. But it's good to see you, Chris, Steve, Christy, AMFM, and the other Philip. Lovely to see you as well. Sola Fide has been infallibly defined since Pope Paul's letters to the Romans. Exactly, yes. That is super true. Since his letter to his central seat and jurisdiction, that is Rome. That's right, the Pauline seat of Rome, of which Peter is simply keeping the seat warm for Paul for now, until the true Pauline successor, me, comes in and reclaims the seat. But yes, that is very much the case. Shellycraft, lovely to see you as well. Shiko, May, thank you so much for supporting. Glad to see you here as well. So many comments here. People keep chatting. I'm not going to be able to go through them all, of course, because a lot of people are watching, a lot of people chatting, which is awesome. But now we have to get to the response itself. So I am going to switch windows to the video itself. And we're going to get started. Geoff, as usual, if you want me to stop, just say stop, we'll respond. All right. Here we go. Let me turn up the quality a bit. There we go.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Council of Trent podcast. I'm your host, Catholic Answers apologist and speaker.
Gotta mute yourself, Paul.
When I speak to people about the papacy, I'll present to them, arguments from Scripture that seem to show that Peter had unique authority among the apostles, that he would often speak for them as a group. One interesting note that I like seeing in Scripture or sharing with people is when you look at the lists of the apostles, in the apostolic lists that contain all of the apostles, I believe there are 4 of them, Peter is listed first in all of them, and Judas is listed last. So that, it's interesting. Well, why would that be? Well, Peter is the leader of the group. And so people will make these arguments, right? Trying to show that Peter had a very important role in the early church, and that provides evidence for the papacy. I came across an article from a Protestant blog, though, saying you could...
I would just say it's fine to say Peter was a leader, a kind of a natural leader, but that doesn't mean his position. Catholics make this mistake, I think, all the time. Peter was a natural leader, I believe. And I would even say, he's a leader of the core apostolic group. I kind of don't see that as much around Paul with Peter in terms of like, because I think Paul was a natural leader too. So I don't think that makes Paul the Pope, but I don't think that made Peter the Pope previous. Yeah. I don't think there was like friction between Paul and Peter. I'm just saying that I think when natural leaders get together, there's a different dynamic than say when one guy is more outgoing and more of a natural leader than the other people.
Yeah, that's it. It's good. It's good to frame it as the possibility of a natural leadership rather than necessarily like a de jure divinely granted leadership. But even then, one could. There's a whole range of leadership models one could interpret for Peter, even divinely given ones, which don't necessarily translate to.
Well, he's obviously like if you're an apostle, there's at least an office, but that doesn't make him like outrank the other apostles.
Yeah, that's it. And I'm still personally very much I'm pretty convinced myself that Peter didn't have like a special office above other apostles, even in a very basic primacy sense, which Orthodoxy does affirm, and which many Protestants do affirm. I'm kind of closer to that one that you have.
What I see in New Testament was he was an apostle to the Jews.
Yeah, that's it.
And I've mentioned this before on your channel. The current papacy doesn't evangelize Jews and would hate that.
At least officially, yeah.
So the irony is like the one thing they actually call out Peter as like, man, you gotta evangelize those Jews. They don't do, and they would probably excommunicate someone for doing. So and I've seen arguments where when in one of the epistles of Peter, where he's talking about Babylon, they're talking about a literal Babylon, that because there was such a large Jewish community in Babylon, where you get the Babylonian Talmud and stuff at the time, was that the Parthian Empire at the time, or maybe I don't know if Rome controlled the I know for like a century or less they controlled that the Mesopotamia area.
Yeah, that's really going to depend, because that Babylon area was right in the middle of like the hotly exchanged zone between them and the Parthians. So yeah, it would really, really, really depend. I was kind of sympathetic to that view a little bit of Peter's reference to Babylon being literal Babylon, and sometimes depending on my mood, I kind of grant it. But I don't know. I'm just genuinely like, I kind of switch between whether it's Babylon or just.
Well, I don't know. The thing is, my position on that is like that's a very much live option. But anyway, but not going down that rabbit trail.
Anyway,
like what it is that I think that is Peter's role in there. He's not head of the entire church, but he's head. He is like the chief, one of the chief guys going to Jews.
Yeah.
Which is not the role of the papacy today, or like, it's not the head of the whole church. But anyway, so keep going.
Yep. Okay.
Run these same exact arguments and say that Paul had a special primacy. Maybe Paul was really the first pope. Look at all these special things about Paul. If you're going to say special things about Peter make him pope, then special things about Paul make him pope as well. And then if everybody's a pope, nobody's a pope, and the argument doesn't work. To help us dismantle this argument, though, I've asked my friend Sonna to come in. He's probably one of the most able defenders of papacy out there today.
But then don't.
So later. I'm excited for him to break this argument down for us. So Suan, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Trent. Thanks for having me on again.
Well, can you also share, you have some news, vocation news, if you will, which you can share with our listeners. I think they'd be excited to hear about.
Yeah, well, so
Swan
I was
might become a Dominican priest,
still in the
which is awesome. But you're not just know at the Oracle. So why don't you could summarize kind of the argument. I mean, I've summarized it a bit, but you could lead us into the argument, and then you had some specific points you wanted to address.
Yeah, so basically this article on this blog called, I think, Triablogue, it has like 51 kind of examples of Pauline Primacy. And the point of this article is to kind of parody Catholic arguments for Petrine primacy and show that you could run, as you said, the same arguments to show that Paul was the first pope. And I guess I'll just want to say a few things first, right? I mean, there is some value in parody objections, because if a parody objection works, then that shows you that there's something wrong with the argument that you've been using.
Too sure.
So, for example, sometimes I see some Catholic apologists use, Peter is mentioned this many times in the scriptures, and that shows that he has a primacy. I mean, it can show that he is an important character, but I think I've also seen a lot of accounts that have Paul mentioned more than Peter. But I also don't think in the first place that's a good criterion to use, how many times someone gets name dropped, right?
Right.
The other thing too is
now,
that some of the
really
parody-
quickly, this is actually really important because Suan and Trent, they both acknowledge there's bad examples that Catholic apologists have used. And what's important is that, and you could very easily tell just by reading the article and by even just by looking at the stuff that it responds to. Because I think the original thing was maybe David Armstrong or someone else, I can't remember. But I even messaged Jason himself just to make sure that was intent with the proof text, that his counter examples of Pauline Primacy, they were parodying the whole spectrum of Roman proof texts for Peter's primacy. So both the good ones, the good ones, quote unquote, presented by the likes of Trent, Suan, Sonna, as well as the very bad ones given by your average Romanist who just wants to dunk on the Protestants. So that's very important, because how they will go on to react to a selection of parallels, because they only respond to a selection of parallels they think are the best, quote unquote, in the article. They tend to speak as if the article was intending just to parody the best examples, and then they act like, oh, what are you seriously saying that? Like, come on, that's not a good parallel. It's like, if you're talking just about the best Romanist proof text, then sure, we'd agree. But so would Jason. His whole point was to parody like the whole spectrum, both good, quote unquote, and bad Petrine proof text. So we'll see this as we go on, but they kind of acknowledge it here that there's bad ones, but then they miss that. Well, that's Jason's also responding to those bad ones in this article as well, not just the good ones you guys like. Keep going.
Yeah, keep going.
He's on this.
I mean,
website.
if you think about it, Judas is mentioned more than many of the other minor apostles.
Yeah, right.
He's not more important.
Well,
Judas primacy confirmed.
I looked at some of these examples, and some of them were like bad, right? Like some of these parodies were not all that great, and so I was wondering, like, is that the point of the parody, to not be good? Or, I mean, because you'd want the parody to be good in that it kind of shows there's a flaw in how Catholic apologetics is done. So what I've decided today, Trent, is to just focus on maybe 6 of the examples that actually kind of
and
work.
That's exactly what I mentioned right here. Like he doesn't seem to, Suan doesn't seem to realize, and I think Trent as well, that the article is trying to also parody bad arguments, not just good ones. So if there's a bad parody there, well, yeah, sure, but it's not trying to parody just the best arguments, although it does parody the quote-unquote best arguments as well, and I don't think they really overcome most of them here.
Worked, or I thought were interesting. But I just want to begin first off by making 2 other comments, right? The first is that these kinds of arguments that you see to establish Pauline primacy, they really aren't at the same level of quality as the Petrine primacy texts. So, for example, you have the summative list that you talked about, especially in Matthew 10:2, where Peter's called protos, which is like first, principal, or chief. You have passages like Luke 22:31, and this one actually, Trent, till this day, I'm just like, wow, this passage is really remarkable. Jesus says to Simon, he says, Simon, Simon, Satan has come to, sift you all like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and so that when you return, you may strengthen your brothers.
Yeah, I'm pausing here as well. Like, this is kind of proving the article's point.
Yeah.
That you will take something that just by reading the thing in itself with the Roman versus Protestant debate just out of your mind, that you just simply, I just don't think anyone who's just reading the text as it is would come to that conclusion without the debate in their mind of Jesus is specifically praying for Peter, therefore authoritative de jure primacy. Like, come, like that is.
I think this is one of the advantages of doing a Bible through the year plan or something like this. I do the McShane plan. I do it in audio. I walk the dog and I listen to the scripture. Okay. And my mind drifts, so I have to be constantly rewinding. So I probably do the Bible through 5 times through the year plan. because of that. So instead of just going to the text and looking for a debate sort of thing, I think what's going on here is it's setting up. Peter's going to deny Christ. So Jesus is getting ahead of this. And so later, it's kind of comforting.
Yeah.
To me, it's a Calvinistic sort of thing too. What is the difference between Peter and Judas? Judas wasn't prayed for by Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay. It's not that his sin was so heinous that he couldn't be forgiven or whatever. It was
Paul
that
facilitated murder. I mean, come on.
What's that?
Paul facilitated murder, so Judas could be forgiven easy.
Yeah. No. So I think if you just take the flow of the text, it's about Peter's upcoming denial.
That's it.
There's nothing in there that is saying. I mean, we had one commenter earlier mention, like, behind all of this, there's a whole thing where it's like, okay, even if you establish Peter as prime, as the Pope, how does that get to Rome and then passed on to the successors? We're leaving all of that out. Okay. But in just terms of this, I think you're right. Suan's kind of proven the point of the article.
That's it. Yeah, and I'm really happy you brought up that interpretation of why Jesus is specifically praying for Peter, because that's exactly how I've just through sober study of the passage. That's exactly what I came to as well. That Christ, in my own personal thing, I think it looks like that Christ specifically is praying for Peter precisely because of actually his more vulnerable faith, his weaker faith, which is why, and the whole reason why Jesus does that is, as we see later, Peter specifically, not the other apostles, but Peter specifically denies Jesus publicly. And so Jesus, it's very clear, as you say, it's prefiguring that fall away from faith. And that's why Jesus is more particularly praying for Peter apart from the other apostles, because of Peter's greater vulnerability. To read the idea that Jesus is praying specifically for Peter because he's the federal head of the apostles, that will then strengthen his brothers in the very specific way of guiding them in an authoritative de jure manner, is not technically impossible, but also neither is the idea that by Mary being graced by God, it means that she also gained laser eye powers. That's technically not impossible, but it's very much unwarranted. It is very, very much unwarranted.
Like, you would never, unless someone in the text, unless Luke or Mark or whomever later in the text kind of says, "Oh, and this is what Jesus meant there." There's no way you would come to that conclusion.
Shows that out,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, and it doesn't. It's just very sensible and should be interpreted as simply Peter taking particular care for Peter because he's more vulnerable. That's it. Nothing to do with authority. And this basically, their appeal to this basically can prove the article's whole point, and how in responding to the Pauline proof text, they're almost 100% correct in their responses to the Pauline proof text. But that's the issue. They don't consistently apply that critical thought to their own Petrine proof text. And we're going to get to that anyway.
Well, this reminds me of the old saying, and I think maybe this is what the original Jason's article gets to, is when all you have is a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail.
That's true. That's a good way to put it, yeah. That saying's very applicable.
Right? Mm. And that could be true or not, right? Like, but you know how, like, if someone has their hobby horse, like, however you feel about contraception, right? Where it's like everything, and you know how you have some tradcasts, or it's like, and we like trace that back to contraception, and you're like, well, I'm not, I'm like everything,
or like the diorites and author bros who are like, oh, well, the West believes in the filioque caused abortion and all that.
Right. It was like the
filioque behind everything bad.
You have to know about that tendency. Part of my mind, I also know, like, how would an Orthodox Jew they would have some of these critiques to us. So you have to be fair, so you have to understand that we're going to have this tendency. Now, I think it is legitimate that, like, once you know about God, like, you see, it makes sense of everywhere in nature and blah, blah, blah. The rising and falling of nations and stuff like that. But that's a very basic message in Scripture. Like, your hobby horse, you don't want to make it like the lens through which you interpret everything. Not you'll see this even in new perspective circles or whatever, right? Where you're like, everything is this, or you get like an insight and then you shove it everywhere in Scripture, and it could be a legitimate insight somewhere, but then you just run roughshod all over Scripture, like. You find out about the divine council stuff from Michael Heiser.
Oh, that's so true.
Right? And it's like, oh, okay, thanks for the insight, Mr. Heiser or Dr. Heiser. And then next thing you know, you run into these Heiser fans where it's like, hey, have you heard about our Lord and Savior? Yeah. Have you heard about our Lord and Savior, the divine council? It's like, come on, guys.
Please, have you read the prophet Michael Heiser, peace be upon him? That is often how they react, unfortunately.
I joke. But
anyway, Trevor, do you think there's some view of Petrine primacy in the NT/early church history that's not a papist one? As an EO, I think Peter was head of the apostles. Yeah, there are others that do ascribe an official headship of Peter that aren't papists. Like, for example, as you say, the Eastern Orthodox view, which does ascribe an official primacy to Peter, or like even this. Well, the Cyprian one's interesting because Cyprian explicitly says that Peter received equal honor and power to the other apostles. So that's explicit that he's equal on official level, but that Peter does have a primacy, a very basic primacy of order in receiving the office. So the office of the apostles in some way originates through Peter as a singular source, but Peter carries the same authority of the apostles as the other apostles. So there's that view. There's an ortho view where it does ascribe some greater degree of authority to Peter. There's a whole spectrum of these kind of views that don't get you to Roman Catholicism. So it is kind of interesting to see those views. I personally don't hold to any view of an official primacy of Peter, although the natural leadership view does seem to make more sense. Anyway, let's keep going. We're 40 minutes in. We're only 4 minutes into the video.
I mean, that's incredible, right? So Satan is coming after all the apostles, and Jesus only expressly prays that Peter's faith may not fail, so that he may come back and strengthen his brothers. I mean, there you see this elevation of Peter that's really remarkable. And then later, as the night goes on, eventually the disciples, they fall asleep in the garden, right? Who does Jesus blame when they all fall asleep? If you look at the Gospel of Mark, Jesus and Matthew, Jesus names Peter as the one that he blames. And then when you go to John 21, and this is kind of just me
that's another example of this, the whole thing of Garden of Gethsemane. Like, why does Jesus single out talking to Peter when all the disciples are asleep? Could it be because Peter is a representative, authoritative head? Could be, but it also could simply be with the fact that Jesus is specifically looking over and looking out for Peter because of his coming failings. Hence why Jesus in that passage, I believe it's basically in the passages about the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus says, watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. And so it's very easily simply interpreted as Jesus particularly taking issue with Peter falling asleep over the other disciples because of his proneness to falling, which is entirely, that's something we can easily see in real life when if there's multiple. Yeah. Maybe it'd be a bit risky for me mentioning, trying to bring this example with you, Geoff, because I don't know if it might have happened with you. But do you ever get instances where your kids, multiple kids, they're all doing something wrong, but you go particularly hard on one of them over others? Does that ever happen? Or
maybe at some point. It might vary depending on situation,
but depending on circumstances. So, and I can imagine scenarios in my own life where everyone was doing something wrong and they all got in trouble in some degree, but one in particular, because of some circumstance, was particularly pointed out saying, hey, don't do that. You can imagine a multiplicity of scenarios of why Peter might have been singled out. If it is his federal headship, that's possible. Sure, it's not in the text though, and the theme of his eventual fall is a much more likely motivation for Jesus singling out Peter. So
they don't, you see, they're kind of working backwards from their kind of set conclusion. This was like, you have like, they have this view, so it colors how they view everything past. So if that could be fine, if I don't think they're saying this rises to the level of like absolute proof, but that could be fine if the papacy was true. But the papacy isn't true. So, from history we can tell that. So then we're well, this is kind of my main critique with Suan's magisterium argument or Sanhedrin argument. It was like, well, I look to the first however many centuries of Christianity and I don't see this. So I know there's something wrong with your argument. I don't know what it is. Let's go find out. Right. Like right away. And another example, so they're not considering, so it makes them not see other possibilities, kind of like how an atheist might not see other possibilities in biology because they just assume naturalism or something like that. Another corollary would be like when they say, you mentioned like Mary full of grace or whatever. Well, maybe I could make the argument that, where sin abounds, grace all the more abounds. So that means Mary was a huge sinner, right? Just based on this one clause out of context.
So true.
So you don't want to do this whole hunt method where you have something and then you're just hunting for support and you build a mountain out of a molehill where you could be, and then it just gets weak. It's weak.
Yeah, you can make so many problems can come out of this. So many problems. Anyway, let's keep going.
Pieces together. Who does Jesus forgive in John 21 explicitly? Peter. And so there's a sense in which when the disciples fail, Peter is that chief representative. When the disciples succeed.
Okay, read John 21 yourself, people. Does anything in the passage even hint that Jesus is forgiving the disciples writ large, like collectively, through Peter? Or simply that Jesus is particularly forgiving Peter because he was the particular one who apostatized? There's a whole reason why the passage is called the restoration of either the restoration of Peter, not the restoration of the apostles, because Peter apostatized, not the other apostles. They cowered away, sure, the other apostles, but they didn't deny Christ like Peter did. And that's
so Peter
why
needs
Jesus forgives him particularly.
It's kind of like maybe mom has to, like, why does mom give more attention to the one kid? Well, maybe because the one kid needs it more.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. So Peter has special needs confirmed. No. The special needs apostle. Oh, no. I don't want to unduly insult one of the blessed apostles themselves, but his actions would kind of lend to that conclusion. Sometimes, let's be real.
Peter's the chief representative. Mm-hmm. And so actually in John 21, what I started noticing are these, what people call undesigned coincidences, right? Where things start coming together and you see a kind of harmony that is really striking. And so there's this idea that all the disciples fail, Jesus blames them. And then when all the disciples, except for John, of course, abandon basically Christ on the cross, it's through Peter that all of them receive the absolution, right? If Peter's forgiven, then all of them also receive the forgiveness in John 21.
The buck stops here.
Right.
All right. Well, let's talk about some of those better examples, because you're right. I mean, I read the list a while ago, but just pointing out things that were unique to Paul, maybe on his seafaring voyages or who he wrote to. We don't make any of those similar arguments for Peter or for anything like that.
Really?
So, I mean, you might get into this a little bit because he brings up the point that Paul wrote the most in the New Testament. I don't want to jump ahead too fast, but I can't help myself. It's my show. I can do what I want. He says, oh, well, Paul wrote so much. He wrote so much in the New Testament. Yeah, that's true. But how relevant is that? So I was thinking about it more. I thought, well, Peter also wrote. His writings are included in the New Testament. But unlike Paul, they're universal in scope. Paul's letters are to specific communities. Peter's have more of a universal application to them, which is something you would tend to see more with an office like his and being the leader of the church.
Well, I could see.
Okay, now this was really bizarre when Trent Horn brought this up. This was like, I was like, what?
Is he doing a reductio ad absurdum? Or is he actually legitimately making this argument?
I won't argue this. I won't go too long and too deep on this, because Trent Horn himself says, look, I wouldn't press this argument too much because there's other nuances you can account for. But the fact is, he still is kind of raising it at least as a potential kind of argument, so it is worth addressing at least briefly.
Peter,
it's really weird, because if you read, open up 1 Peter 1, chapter 1, verse 1. What does it say? Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia.
Oh, so, who are the dispersion?
Who are they, Geoff?
I think they're Jews. Which would make sense, right?
Apostle to the circumcision, one might say.
So I think it's also, if you take it as he's writing to Jews in the diaspora. He's writing to Jews in the diaspora, if that's pronounced correctly, and he so there's other comments in the epistle. I'm not remembering off the top of my head. Like faith is ours. I think he's kind of talking to Jews and saying, he's mentioning he's talking about there's Gentile believers too, and this sort of thing. He's writing to Jews.
Yep. And point being, it's such a weird argument to say that Paul's letters were only very specifically to communities, but Peter's were universal in scope, which is expected on him being the head of the church. So no, Peter's first letter explicitly is aimed at specific regions of churches. So not the church universal. I mean, of course, it's weird anyway, because Trent Horn has to grant that the scriptures, even if they're initially aimed at one community, have universal application eventually. So it's a weird argument anyway. But then if you look even in 2 Peter as well, which doesn't explicitly name a new audience, but it says in chapter 3, verse 1, 2 Peter, this is now the second letter I am writing to you, beloved. Now, the second letter, what was the first letter? 1 Peter. And so logically, who's the you that he's writing to again? The communities in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So both of Peter's letters were specifically aimed at certain communities, and just as Paul's were. So this is a really, really weird kind of argument to raise, even as a light potential thing, which again, Trent will say after this that it's not something he pressed, but the fact that he bring it up at all is really, really bizarre. And depending on where you land on text critical debates, if you look at the letter to Ephesians, for example, I personally side on Ephesians, because there's debate on whether en Epheso, in Ephesus, in the opening of the Ephesians letter, is actually original or not, which would affect whether it was specifically to Ephesus or if it was a cyclical letter across multiple regions. And so if one was to land on because there's good text, I believe the textual evidence is in support of en Epheso, but otherwise there is enough good textual data that one could reasonably land on the side of the letter to Ephesians, not specifically being to Ephesus, but a cyclical letter with no specifically named recipient, which would basically put that letter on par to Peter's own letter here, in not Peter's own letters in being quite wide. And so, yeah, depending where you go with that, that could be something very interesting. The person says Jude's epistle is universal in scope, which would make sense if Jude was Pope, something I have a priori assumed. That's basically it. Yeah, that's basically it. But it also doesn't make sense to say that a letter aimed at a certain community versus a letter that's universal in scope, as if to imply that there is a letter that Peter wrote letters that were not aimed at specific people, and they'll just kind of like
it's also taking
they'll kind of thrown into the wind to be carried to whoever gets them. Like that's kind of like what they're implying with this, what Trent's implying with this argument, which is really weird. Like Peter just writes letters and just throws them into the wind, and whoever gets them, it applies to them. So it's weird because all letters by their nature are sent to a specific group or individual.
I think they're confusing the later paradigm of papal encyclicals.
That's it. Yeah, that's that.
And then they're reading that back into history.
Yeah, that's it. Shelley Craft would make sense if my favorite paper saying so true. So true.
Now mine is it would be
and this is true as well. St. Paul wrote to the Romans, which means he had jurisdiction over Rome. Very true. He spoke authoritatively over the Romans.
We've mentioned this in the past. What it does show is that Peter is not mentioned. The traditional Roman Catholic claim is that the church at Rome was founded by Paul and Peter, which no one believes anymore. So how you get papal succession when there really isn't, when the original claims of the papacy rely on Peter and Paul founding the church at Rome. I'm not sure how that works out, unless you say then they went there and then they did stuff and then they passed their authority. But
which I can imagine.
But that's not the traditional argument. So I think one thing. By the way, somebody from Legionnaire did the slap some Newman on. I sent him the link a few days ago, and then he sent it back to me with because of the contraception thing, where I said development incoming, but like. But I'm, this is just kind of the way it is, though, is that like they kind of lose a historical debate and then they kind of switch. And then 50, 100 years later, I'm not supposed to remember that. It's like hey, when John Paul II was Pope, you're arguing this way. And now in 2022, you're arguing in another way. I'm old enough where I can remember how you used to argue before Francis, and now you're. But the same thing with Newman, right?
It's exactly like we'll move on after this. One more little thing I want to respond, and then I think we'll do long stretches where we'll just let them make the whole argument for a certain parallel. But one of the things it kind of reminds me. In 1984, it's like, oh my god, this is like 1984. Every boomer conservative ever, but actually, it reminds me of it because they'll go in 1984 where it's like they're at war with Oceania, and everyone's like, oh, death to Oceania, blah blah blah, and then suddenly the propaganda switches and says when East Asia was once at that very moment, East Asia was their ally. Suddenly they immediately switch. Oh, East Asia's our enemy. They were always our enemy, and then everyone's like, yeah, East Asia was always our enemy. Destroy East Asia. It's kind of like what's happening here, where it's just like, oh well. Rome, Peter and Paul founded Rome. We all know that. Oh wait, they actually didn't. Oh well, we all knew that Peter and Paul didn't found Rome. They just organized it. Yeah, Peter and Paul just and that was just a dozen other papal arguments out there where they just pretend it just never happened.
Yeah.
Anyway,
like the papacy is the source of all unity, and then Francis is like, the magisterium is the source of all. Then it's like the German bishops. It's like Catholicism, amorphous of Catholicism in general is the source of all unity.
Let's keep going. Because Suan brings up a really fascinating Pauline proof text that Angua actually does cite in the article as well. In the fifth point where it says Paul refers to his authority over all the churches. So this is really significant.
An office like his and being the leader of the church.
Well, I could see a response to that given 1 Corinthians 7:17 when Paul talks about a rule that he lays down on all the churches. Mm-hmm. And then obviously given the canon of scripture now, that is, Paul's texts are universal. But I mean, let's just Mm-hmm.
And then for me, I would not. It's why these arguments are helpful. That's why I would not press this argument myself in favor of Petrine primacy, because of course John writes letters that are received. They're not written to a particular audience either.
Which is okay. I'll briefly look at that. That's kind of bizarre as well because First John, for example, it doesn't mention a specific audience, but that doesn't automatically entail therefore it's just to everyone, not
whom it may concern.
No. But then second, we look at 2 John, Second John is directed to a specific lady and her children, and Third John is directed to a certain Gaius. So 2 of the letters explicitly mention their audience, and the first one doesn't, but that doesn't automatically mean like no particular audience. But either way, red. There's just a tiny minor thing. Won't lay on it.
Yeah. Let's
Notice the counter argument that Suan brings up, the potential one, where Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 does refer to a rule that he lays down in all the churches, and this is really big. I'm gonna specifically highlight, bring this up now, because I think it really does go to show the double standards they work with. Because we look at 1 Corinthians 7, the famous passage, very controversial passage about the nature of marriage and whether Paul's talking about the eschaton or a specific local crisis and all that. Very significant passage. But here's what he says in chapter 17. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Now, so imagine this. Paul's giving a specific, very wide-ranging moral command and saying that this is his command, not just the command, his command specifically in all the churches. Now, they dismiss. They don't even address this at this point as a significant passage for Pauline primacy. But Geoff, how do you think this passage would be treated if this was written by Peter?
Peter's the Pope.
Yeah, they will be all okay. It's admittedly speculative, but I think it is a very, very, very likely, extremely likely outcome that they would be all over this passage of Peter saying, "My rule in all the churches." Like that is the exact nature of the papacy. That's the whole. That's the whole function it serves.
Look,
and yet we have Paul saying it.
Paul, if Mary burps, okay, in scripture, like they develop a massive like dogma around it. Like you don't think like, right? Like this is how they've operated for centuries. And I'm not. This is not to make fun of Trent or Suan because they've kind of inherited a system they believe in, but and they kind of, based on being in the system, kind of have to like are kind of blind to kind of like how it operates. I think, if I'm being generous to them, I know they're very smart or whatever, but I think it's the paradigm thing is that. That's kind of what goes on is that it's the golden hammer problem is that you have a hammer, everything's a nail, so Mary says, hey, what's for lunch? Next thing you know, you got a dogma 1,000 years later. And or the thing with Peter is like, oh, Peter does X. That's the papacy. Peter does that. That's the papacy. That supports the papacy because obviously Peter's an apostle. Now, did Peter actually do much in Rome besides die? I don't know.
That's a fun way to frame it. He didn't do much besides that. Well, he preached in Rome and all that. Yeah,
did
but
he?
Then he died.
Did he? I mean, we know he was probably sent to Rome to be executed.
I think
how much actual history do we have of him like doing stuff in Rome?
I think the testimony is early enough and reasonable enough to assume that. So like we'll have Papias, for example, where he mentions he specifically references the testimony in this case of a specific John the Elder who was a disciple of the Lord, and so we can assume very likely acquainted with Peter himself, who mentions in the writing of Mark that it was during when Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome. And so, and there's no other countervailing data we have that makes that an impossibility. And so I think it's very reasonable to assume that he did. But yeah, either way, we don't have a whole ton of what he did other than preach and die in Rome. So yeah, that is something. And Solus Christus, very good point. James White rightly said that the papists are suffering from the Peter syndrome. That's exactly what it is.
That's probably what I'm saying with the golden hammer problem is that
it's kind of like how Christian, like even normie evangelicals in particular, or even like very hot people who are just really into typology, they see Jesus under every little sentence and word of the Old Testament. It's like, but with Romanists, it's like they see Peter under everything of the New Testament. so that's kind of what that is. Well,
there's a way that like we've gone over typology stuff before. So I think there's a way in where that's legitimate, but if it goes unconstrained, you're kind of like, and kind of what we said about typology, you don't use it as a primary proof. That's kind of after the fact.
It has to be rooted in real things first. The whole nature of typology is reading back into something. Anyway, back to the video. We shall continue.
Or Jude or things like that. But it's just, I find it funny when people, when they make these kinds of points, they are susceptible to kind of a different sorts of reply. So why don't I'll throw back to you, bring up the examples you thought were the most promising that could show Paul had some kind of primacy and why they're not like the arguments for Peter's primacy.
Yeah, so I mean, the first one that I have on the list, and this is, I'm quoting from the website, number 20. He says, only Paul refers to himself as having a rod, a symbol of authority. And he quotes 1 Corinthians 4:21. Well, if you read 1 Corinthians 4:21, here's what Paul says. What do you desire? That I come to you with a rod or with love and a spirit of gentleness? So already this is kind of off to a bad start.
It's like, it's more of a misquote. He's not even saying I have one. He's
and again, remember, this is where they seem to. This is where I think they first start to miss it as well. Apart from the other first point, that the article isn't just parodying their favorite examples of Petrine proof text, but genuinely bad ones that they themselves would say are bad as well. So that's not much of a thing. But even then, I think they miss some key notes with this one. So I'll just keep going until
he's saying, aren't you glad I didn't come to you with one?
Right. And it's very casual, right? Unlike, for instance, the keys of the kingdom, which play a major role in Matthew 16:19. So that's the first kind of thing to dock,
and it's
right?
It's not like Aaron's rod. It's like the rod just a parent uses to whap their kid on the butt.
Like the book of Proverbs, right? Yeah. Don't spare the child the rod, you spoil him.
Yeah.
And then also, obviously, here in the case of Paul describing himself, right? This is an instance where Paul is saying, okay, look, let's just try to be charitable to this objection, okay? So, I mean, Paul is saying that he can have this rod of discipline, right? But if you look at, for example, Matthew 16:19, the keys are being divinely given to Peter, right? So there's a sense in which there's something already, another point of difference between what Paul is saying here and what is being given to Peter, right? One is self-described with Paul with the rod, the other is divinely given with the keys to Peter. The third thing I'll point out too is that I just don't see, for instance, a typological argument like the Isaiah 22, Matthew 16 argument being able to be deployed here, right? And so already then we have three reasons why this is not a good parody, right? The first is that the metaphor is too casual with Paul's use of a rod of discipline. The second is that this rod, even if he has it, right, in some substantial way, it's self-described versus divinely given. The third thing is that you can't really draw a strong typological argument like an office of Eliakim in this case, as in the Peter case with the keys.
Very good. All right. What's the second one?
Okay, so summarize. So too casual of a reference versus a more elaborate demonstration of the giving of the keys. Then second, Paul's rod is self-described by Paul versus divinely given in Matthew 16, the keys for Peter. And third, that you can't draw a typological argument like you can for the keys. So first one with the casual one is it's weird because the brevity or length of a statement will not affect the substance of what it is referring to. So if hypothetically, for example, the passage of Matthew 16 was just a very brief, it was just talking about something, and then just Jesus or just Peter himself just casually mentions, oh yeah, I got the keys of the kingdom. Anyway, that wouldn't, whether it was that brief or as elaborate as the Matthew 16:18 we have today, that wouldn't change the substance of what the nature of the keys is. It would affect to be sure, it would affect how much we can glean about the keys, but it wouldn't change the nature of it in itself just because it's casually mentioned. Like just me casually mentioning right now, oh yeah, Jesus is king, and not elaborating more. That doesn't make his claim to kingship like just casual and non-substantial. So that doesn't really work at all. The nature of a reference doesn't affect the thing in itself as it actually is. The second one, that Paul's rod is self-described versus Matthew 16, the keys being divinely given, that's really an apples and oranges, or rather, as I like to say, apples and circuit boards comparison, because Peter could describe in later times, and perhaps even did, referred to his own power of the keys. And one could even argue that or one could almost argue in a way, depending on how you interpret the keys, that he does exactly that in Acts 15, where in the Jerusalem Council, when he says, that the Lord said that it was by my mouth that the Gentiles would hear the word and all that stuff. So Peter's self-referring to his authority there. Just because he refers to himself having something doesn't therefore mean it wasn't divinely given, if that makes sense. Peter could refer to to himself, and likewise Paul could refer to a divinely given authority to himself.
He is talking about his divinely given authority, because the ability to discipline as an apostle is a divinely given authority.
That's it. Yeah, that's it.
Yep,
go on. Sorry, go on.
I was saying, I don't want to get into the papacy arguments with the Eliakim and stuff, because we've gone over that in the past, and other people have gone, and it's gone over in Triablogue. They go over and just type in Eliakim and stuff, and you'll see plenty of articles on that. But I think what his Suan's argument basically is, after that first one, is that, well, we've established the papacy being from Peter via these other means, so that's what makes this illicit.
Yeah, I mean, to steelman him a bit.
Is that not what the argument is?
To steelman him a little bit, he's more so referring to, look, the text in itself is more substantial than the Pauline one. But even then, we'd say, well, that's kind of begging the question on what it is. We kind of disagree with your thingos and all, but that would kind of get back into the weeds of the main argument, which would defeat the point of the brevity of a parallel argument. But nonetheless, the third and final one is that, so summarize, to kind of say so far, very much possible. And one could even beg the question, why would Paul refer to him using a rod, i.e., his authority of discipline and correction over a church, if that wasn't divinely appointed? Are they implying when they say this that Paul is trying to exercise an authority that he gave himself and wasn't actually divinely appointed? Is not Paul's ability, his right to exercise a rod, so to speak, over churches on the basis of his divine apostolic authority? Is that not the case? Are they really trying to say that Paul's just kind of given himself a title?
So we don't have to repeat ourselves. Just keep in mind, if Peter said this about himself over the centuries, would it have been used by? We
wouldn't hear the end of it. And the third and final one is that there isn't a significant typological parallel, which begs the question on how much, if at all, of a typological parallel with Eliakim there is. I'm kind of still kind of in flux in it. I was initially kind of against it. And for some reasons, I still kind of am, but I am kind of open to an illusion.
I saw in the book, the Eliakim revelation ties Eliakim to Jesus.
Yeah, that's it. So that
not Peter,
which biblically makes 1,000 times more sense typologically, where Jesus is very commonly
Jesus
portrayed.
is a Trinitarian. He's the prime minister.
That's it. Jesus himself, very commonly all throughout Scripture, is portrayed as the viceroy of the Father. So that typology makes much more sense. Right. But either way, the third one is that there's a typological parallel with Eliakim. Let's just assume so far that there is a significant typological parallel with the Eliakim passage. And so he says there isn't a significant typology with the rod. I beg to differ. How often is the symbol of a rod? Because that's what this is all about in the end. He appealed to the symbol of the keys, what that means, and how it was used in Eliakim. Likewise, we can appeal to the symbol of the rod. How's the rod used throughout Scripture? Ubiquitously used in reference to authority, including God's own authority. For example, Psalm 23, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Why is the symbol of the rod used? Because, for the dual purposes, for shepherds and for parents. So one for disciplining and the other one for beating away wolves, for example. And perhaps also giving the sheep a little bit of a spank. I don't know if they did that or didn't do that, but it does make sense. Either way, there's a common theme of all uses of rod, of authority, and that is used quite significantly with the power of God in the Old Testament. So actually, yes, we could very easily, if we want, tie a typological parallel to Paul's use of the rod with, for example, Psalm 23, where it is described that the Lord has this rod in order to guide the church, the sheep. And so this is just wrong. This is just simply wrong. We can draw a typological parallel very easily with the rod, using the same standards that Suan does for the Eliakim parallel, where Eliakim is never mentioned at all. It's simply the fact that keys are mentioned and Eliakim has these keys and they do something just as Peter's keys do something. And so, we can very easily make that parallel too.
All right.
Yep. Let's keep going. Second argument.
Oh, the second one is, so this is the name count one, right? So the book of Acts, which mentions all of the apostles, this is number 8 on the website, discusses Paul more than any other apostle. Actually, that's number 11. Number 8 is Paul is mentioned more in the New Testament than any apostle, right? So one of the issues that I have with this is that like a mere name count is not entirely useful. Okay, so it might be the case that someone is present, let's say more often in the narrative, or they might be located in the room, right? But for instance, let's take like Acts 15. So obviously Paul is mentioned, but when you look at who gives the bulk of the speeches there, it's Peter and it's James, right? So not every instance where Paul is even mentioned is going to be an instance of him being a main or primary character, right? I mean, suppose, for instance, that Peter's mentioned, let's say, maybe 150 times in the New Testament. But let's suppose that every time he's mentioned, he is the primary character of the story. Whereas Paul, maybe half the time he's a primary character, other times he's a background character. Well, that makes a difference, right? How often is this person a primary character?
Right.
And so just the mere name count, I'm going to say just right up front, it's not a good argument. And I don't think Catholics should use it either. I mean, if you really want to play it that way, like in the Gospels, Peter is mentioned the most of among all the apostles below Jesus Christ himself. All right. So we can kind of pick and choose, right? Like if I want to use this example, I can use the gospel examples, right? So, I mean, that's just not
because it's not just that. It's not just quantity. It's like quality. Like how is Peter referred to in the Gospels is what's more important. And you ably show that it's in a leadership capacity and other things like that.
And the other thing I'll say too is just, we mentioned this quote multiple times before, but it's worth mentioning again. In J.N.D. Kelly's book, The Anglican Scholar, A Dictionary of Popes, he talks about how Peter in the first 12 chapters of Acts has an undisputed leadership over the entire church, right? So
musculars.
If I have to hear about J.N.D. Kelly one more time, I'm going to build a time machine and
I'm going to punch a hole in this drywall if I hear J.N.D. Kelly one more time. He is like, I wonder. I would love to email him saying, "Hey, how do you like all these papers using your work?" And then he, J&D Kelly, an Anglican, replies with, "What on earth?"
No. This is the thing, though. It's like I'm okay with saying like it depends how it's used. I don't want to get on a J&D Kelly tangent, but it depends how it's used. I don't mind you mentioning, like, when I mention Catholic scholars who don't believe in early papacy, I do that to open up the eyes of Catholics to look at the primary evidence, not that, like some Catholic scholars disagree with me. It also kind of throws them for a loop, which is fun, but it sets them off balance. But I want to look at the primary evidence, not that you can always find someone who on somebody else's side who whatever. I don't care.
Yeah, that's it. Indeed, so true. Kelly has spoken. So it would be Kelly locutus est, causa finita. Kelly has spoken. The case is closed. That's very often how he's treated in these discussions.
All right, we need to keep moving.
Yes, let's finish this and then we'll.
In that instance, too, you have Peter dominating the first 12 chapters of Acts, and now of course Paul is mentioned in the narrative as well. So it's not as if to nuance this objection. It's not as if Peter isn't there in the book of Acts. Clearly in the first 12 chapters, he does have this unique foundational role.
And Peter is depicted in a leadership role. The primary narratives in Acts are specifically about Paul's missionary journeys and other things, like when he's sent to Rome for imprisonment. They're narratological, they're narratives about Paul's life as a traveling missionary versus Peter's role where you have a leadership capacity there.
Okay, so before you give yours, on one hand, again, we agree with their response to the proof text, but it does amply show how I believe they missed the forest through the trees, because with the critical eye that they say, well, hang on, that's my phone. Really quickly, you get talking.
All right. Well, I'm gonna wait for Paul. Like and subscribe. Let's see.
I'm back. Anyway,
okay.
Anyway, so I have to be a little bit more quieter. They prove its point, but because they say, well, look, if you look at the context, in what manner is Paul mentioned? Just because he's mentioned the most doesn't mean anything without the context, and that's 100% true. That's kind of really the reverse point of the parallel, to say that just simply looking at big numbers or something that looks significant without context, that doesn't actually mean anything. It can be misleading. But then all we need to do is simply ask them to apply that same level of critical thinking, just one layer deeper, because they try to nuance it by saying, well, Peter's not just mentioned a lot in Acts, but he's mentioned a lot in a leadership context. But then we need only apply the same critical analysis that they just did now to them to say, okay, in what specific context is Peter acting like a leader? Because you can easily we can assume that they mean a leadership context above the other apostles, but we can simply ask, well, hang on a second, we can agree with that, but the context of these leadership contexts may simply mean the generic kind of apostolic leadership, not necessarily a primacy leadership. We simply need to ask them again, in what context is Peter acting as a leader in these things?
You can be a leader on a sports team without being the or even if you get assigned captain on a team. Yeah, that doesn't mean like you're in charge of the other. You're not the coach.
Yeah, that's it.
And the captain doesn't get to, like, it's kind of an honorific thing. You get to do the coin toss.
There is a colossal spectrum of potential manifestations of leadership that Peter could have, anywhere between being exactly like the apostles to the absolute supreme God Emperor over the apostles. There's a billion different ways that this can manifest. As
earlier, a natural leader. He kind of said, he kind of implied, but I don't think he meant to. He must have not meant to. That Paul doesn't have like a leadership role or something like that. He's an apostle, and that's what I'm saying. No one's saying Peter isn't a leader, because he's an apostle. It's just the same. He's not. We're just arguing he's not the head of the entire church. And I don't. You have to me, like reading Acts 15, that James looks like he's the head of the church.
Yeah. But then they'll nuance the hell out of that.
And because Jerusalem is the center of the church.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. But then, of course, they'll nuance the hell out of that one and not apply the same standard. But either way.
Mm. All right, number 3. So this is another very popular one. It's Paul wrote more books of the New Testament than any other apostle.
There it is. Right? There it is.
So, I mean, there are 3 responses that I want to give.
Really quickly as well, because I think you showed some confusion as well, where they say Acts shows Peter being a leader, but then it shows Paul being a missionary, as if there's a difference with the apostles. Like, what? Like, come
Peter
on, really?
was being a missionary too.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what was Acts 2? So, like, if we're gonna put a disjunct, like, that is so bizarre. With respect to the apostles, putting a disjunct between leadership role and missionary work is virtually impossible, because the whole point of the apostolic ministry is that they have the power and authority to proclaim the gospel.
Doesn't an apostle mean they're like an ambassador or emissary?
Sorry?
Doesn't an apostle like literally mean like you're an emissary?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is its thing. It means the sent one, which is of course etymological fallacy. But yeah, that is exactly what it is. It does refer to that kind of ambassadorial role. So that's really bizarre to try and put in juxtaposition leadership versus missionary work with respect to the apostles. That just does not work.
I think we can plow through this, because this one is like, he's making fun of your previous arguments, so like, critique this one.
There it is.
So, I mean, there are 3 responses that I want to give, right? The first is that, look, I think there's an alternate explanation for why we have more Paul's.
Oh, an alternate explanation.
And it's because Paul was literate. He was trained to be, he was trained under Rabbi Gamaliel. He was obviously literate. He obviously was very highly educated. Whereas in Acts 4:13, we know that Peter was illiterate. He was unlettered. He was quite ordinary in terms of his educational backdrop as a Galilean fisherman. So, I mean, already then it's like, well, we're not really assessing, let's say, what that person was objectively given by God, right? If they were given a primacy. So suppose, like, we look at the amount of books that Trent Horn has written versus the amount of books that Pope Francis has written, right? And let's say we see that Trent Horn has written more books. Does that mean that he has a greater authority?
Right. Or think about that same argument. You could say, well, Paul had more, and there's people who do. This isn't I mean, it is a crazy view, but this is a view some people hold, which is that Paul has more authority to us than Jesus does. You have dispensationalists who hold this view. And you could argue, well, Paul had more authority in the church because he wrote more than Jesus did. Jesus didn't write anything. But it's right. The arguments just fall apart.
I mean, the other thing, too, that I should mention is, even though we are indebted to Paul for giving us a lot to think about in terms of justification and in terms of just the relationship between Israel and the church, Peter's testimony is our primary source of Jesus, right? So if we were trying to reconstruct the life of Jesus from Paul, we could get some substantial details like the death, the resurrection, some miracles, some teaching on divorce. But in terms of what we primarily know about Jesus, the stories that we love, right? If you believe in Mark in priority, then Mark based his testimony off of Peter, right? And so Peter's voice is actually the chief voice by which all of us gain access to the life and teachings of Christ.
Pause.
And so even there, like when we look at
that's just another example. How they just insert little things of chiefness and primacy in things which just have nothing to do with it.
I think this is a bigger problem where people are like, Jesus doesn't mention homosexuality in the Gospels, but Paul does. Okay? Paul is speaking for Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay.
But what's something?
So it doesn't have to be I don't know if they mean to go down this route, but this can definitely be twisted down this. Is that even though yes, we like the stories and it's
just don't try to draw a hard separation between Paul and Jesus, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously you need, we need the Gospels, we need the Pauline letters, we need all of Scripture. Some are more foundational than others, right? Like, so if you lost, if you lost like Jude, right? You're not in the same shape as if you lost like the Gospel of John.
Yep. And good point here. Fact check. Jesus wrote in the sand. # papism destroyed. That's so true. Yeah. Boom. Jesus wrote. Absolutely annihilated.
But tradition hasn't saved that. So.
Simon didn't say it. But so to start with this first one, what's really kind of bizarre about it is that St. Peter's the chief voice from which we get all. Well, I mean, again, that does rely on Mark and priority, which not necessarily a given. So yeah, but even if we grant that, John's gospel is both longer and clearly based on a unique witness that doesn't just try to expand on Mark. So it's very easy. We could very easily argue, and especially given John, it's much more explicit with the high Christology. So really, we could very easily say that John is the chief lens through which we learn about the life and claims of Jesus.
Well,
and
it's more inner circle, right? Like John is more like inner circle stuff, and
that's it.
Synoptics are more public teaching, right?
That's it. So it's a really bizarre claim to try and make, and we can very easily reverse it. But as to the response to the argument itself, that Paul himself wrote more books in the New Testament, I think they do show an inconsistency in their logic, because Trent did point, was it Trent or Sonna? I think one of them said it, but I think they both agreed that Peter's more often in Acts mentioned in a leadership capacity, right? And so that would at least lend some credence to their view. Well, if this argument about Paul writing more of the New Testament, it functions along that exact same line of logic, because the New Testament aren't just books. They're not just books that some dude writes. They are manifestations of authority. And so if Paul has the most written texts of all our New Testament, that can very easily be, that's very easy to show as a parallel to the claim.
And also rules for the churches, right?
Yeah, that's it. They're all, even if they were just to specific communities, A, they were communities all around the Christian world. B, they are recognized as having universal binding authority. And so we can very easily take that as simply saying, as therefore, with the same line of logic as, hey, Peter's shown more in a leadership capacity in Acts, therefore Petrine primacy, very much easily, in fact, much more easier, we can say, hey, Paul is clearly much more active with universal governance of the churches via the means of letters, therefore Pauline primacy.
Well,
and of course they'd argue with the whole thing with, oh well, Paul wrote more than Jesus, therefore that would show Jesus' authority is bad, which is ludicrous. Well, we can just reverse that on the whole thing with Peter and Jesus. I mean, how many times, like, Jesus does flex his authority a bit, not all the time though, not every single time. And
yeah,
so
Paul, you get more of the rules for the church elders, excommunication, blah 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 blah. So, but I think the main thing, and we should probably keep moving, is that Jason is intentionally giving a bad argument here. So,
sorry, 1 second. You keep talking, Geoff. Just 1 second.
So, Jason is intentionally given a bad argument here, which I don't think Suan is understanding. I'm going to read some of the comments. Shelley Crown. I also believe that the keys are real, not a symbol. Real presence of the key. Let's see if I.
So true. Real presence for the keys. That's 100% me.
John wrote the last book of the Bible. John was the first
symbolic. They're just symbolic keys. Oh,
yeah. Let's keep trucking.
Yeah. Well, tell me this. Oh yeah, people subscribe to A Goy for Jesus. But yeah, papers, please tell me where Jesus says, "Oh, the keys are just a symbol." I don't think so. Therefore, yeah. But yeah, anyway, I think we've shown the same line of logic can simply be.
They're just not getting that Jason was trying to just parody bad arguments here.
That's it. Not that he's not just trying to parody good arguments against the papacy. But either way, I think they've exposed some inconsistent logic with this. So yeah.
New Testament, just doing a mere number count is not going to be helpful, right? And also, I don't like viewing the New Testament as competing, right? Where, Peter wrote the Peter's witness is the primary source of the Gospels, whereas Paul's is the pastoral letters. It's like, okay, no, let's not do that, right? Let's not put them in conflict.
Peter's shown more in a leadership role, but Paul's more in a missionary role.
You're putting them in conflict in that sense, yeah.
Oh yeah, and you say Paul mentions justification by faith. Well, James too. And I don't know if they do this, but I mean,
all right, yeah, we need to move.
The last thing I want to say is this. So I've noticed there's this.
I apologize. Yeah. I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, but what you said there, I think that's very helpful because I've noticed Protestants who put the New Testament in conflict. They'll say, "Well, Jesus didn't really teach about justification. That was Paul's job in Galatians," and it's like, no, now you're like trying to make excuses instead of looking at it as like an entire whole. I feel like sometimes I see that on the other side a little bit more instead of, trying to, setting Paul and James and Paul or Jesus in conflict with each other in this regard.
I would say that when Paul is giving a specific technical description of justification should be given more weight when you're considering justification than, say, a passage about Jesus talking to the rich young ruler. Not that you don't factor it in, but when Paul is explicitly saying, we're talking about justification here, all right, that's more important than a narrative passage.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Yeah. It's just because in the end, Paul is speaking with the authority of Christ. So that's why the whole thing with red letter Bibles is kind of cringe.
Yes.
So yeah.
All right, keep it moving.
This is how you do it. But really quickly as well, the important thing that they mentioned before with this objection they were just looking at, it was actually very important. So notice how they do the whole thing with nuancing of Paul wrote more. But we need to look at why the circumstances, why Paul wrote more. Maybe it's because Peter was illiterate and all that, which isn't necessarily a given with the Greek term used there. Agrammatos doesn't necessarily mean you can't read and write. But even if it did, Peter in the end did write some letters and he simply used an amanuensis, a scribe. I forgot how to pronounce it, but basically a scribe. Yeah, Paul did the same thing. So even illiteracy wouldn't stop Peter from pumping out more letters. So the question remains, either way though, notice how they're willing to go with that route of nuancing in order to explain that greater prominence of Paul, but they won't do the same with something as very basic and vague as
the whole
I've
point of the
prayed for you,
article is
Peter.
unequal standards.
Yeah, unequal weights and measures.
Yeah.
Exactly what it is. Anyway, let's get going.
So I apologize. I didn't mean to set you. I just noticed that, but I don't want to derail the train.
No, I appreciate it. So the third, the last point I want to make here is just also a kind of like a fallacy that I've noticed in a lot of Protestant thought. And it's this idea that the New Testament documents and texts are identical to the events themselves, right? So what the New Testament is, it's the obviously with the canon, it's the divinely authorized and privileged inerrant witness for what happened, right? But just because, for instance, Paul wrote more books of the New Testament, that doesn't mean that he is, if you will, more of the New Testament times, or he's more of the New Testament age, right?
Interesting.
So the text is giving us a kind of window. Right?
Likewise, just because Peter's mentioned more in a leadership capacity in Acts doesn't mean that he necessarily was more frequent in a quote-unquote leadership capacity. Yeah, hello?
Yeah.
Let's suppose that, Paul is just the one who's the most vocal, right? That doesn't mean that he is the bulk of the New Testament.
You mean like
What we're
Peter?
And Peter, what if he was just the most vocal as well? What if he was just a natural leader? Bruh. Oh man, this is good. This is good. You want to say anything or just keep going?
Yeah, I was just going to make the same point. Like, that's
it.
I feel like the Leonardo DiCaprio meme, like pointing to the TV. Look.
Nah, more. Yeah. or with me, it's more like.
Doing is we have to look underneath the text to try and picture everything that's going on.
Thank you.
And so just because, right, Paul wrote most of the New Testament, that doesn't mean he is most of the New Testament or he is everything that happens, so to speak. So that's just another nuance I want to bring in, because a lot of scholars, what they've done is when they've tried to reconstruct the history of the early church and picture, what exactly was going on, they noticed like, okay, we really have a lot of Paul's perspective, right? Which is great. But it seems as if when we look at how the earliest Christians remembered Peter versus Paul, right? Peter was remembered, especially when you look at the Gospels, which, come a few decades later. Peter is remembered very highly. And also, from what I can recall, almost all the
with Irenaeus, he's virtually remembered as an equal with Paul. So, yeah.
In the church, they were split on the person of Paul. Paul was something like a polarizing figure.
Yeah.
Whereas recent scholars have argued Peter
seems
seems to have been kind of.
What's that?
You think there might be a reason why Paul was a polarizing figure?
I don't know, Geoff. Can you tell us why?
Well, first, he was an apostle abnormally born, so it'd be easier to challenge his authority.
Yeah.
Right? And then I think that would be the main reason.
Yeah,
and
there you go.
Who else was challenging his authority? And also, we probably know of more people challenging his authority as opposed to Peter's authority because he wrote more letters.
Yeah. We can very easily simply say more people challenge his authority because of his authority is more obvious.
Doesn't John have to reprimand someone for not and is it 2nd John or something?
Third
like
John,
that?
I believe. Yeah, I think it's 3rd John where he talks about someone who rejected them. Yeah.
Right. So there's probably just knowing how many times pastors have to deal with crap within their own congregations, not, even say genuine Christians or whatever. Like I would imagine the apostles, even Peter or whatever, probably had to deal with stuff that's just not recorded. So
yep.
It's hard to say.
Don't forget, as they themselves just said, just because
Paul wrote them.
It's yeah. Anyway.
More universally loved and remembered in the church.
Interesting. All right, what's the next one?
So the next one is Paul is the only apostle who is called God's chosen vessel who will bear his name before Jews and Gentiles. And this is Acts chapter 9, verse 15. So this is when,
first objection.
Saul is on his way to persecute Christians. And then, Jesus appears. And then Ananias is told by God, hey, you need to, bring Paul into the church and heal him. And so one of the points here is that God is saying, yes, like Paul is his chosen vessel to reach the Jews and the Gentiles, to reach their kings, right? And so this is a very significant honor given to Paul. And so I think we should just emphasize that, okay, at the same time that we're nuancing, let's say, arguments for Pauline primacy, that doesn't mean that Paul doesn't have a special importance in the New Testament.
Right, he's not a nobody.
Exactly. Now, the problem with this objection is that, look, if you like, obviously when God calls someone his chosen vessel, that is a very important and special title. But you can't say that this is a title that only Paul has, because in Acts chapter 15, verse 7, in the Jerusalem Council, Peter stands and he says, brothers, in the early days that God chose me from among you, that by my mouth, the Gentiles would be received into the church, right? And so Peter's also saying that he was distinctively chosen by God to bring the Gentiles
looks like he's about
into
to
the
explode.
church, to minister to both Jews
Hold
and
on,
Gentiles.
hold,
right? So what we're already seeing here
wait till you see the whites of their eyes.
is we can't say that Paul only has this title when we see Peter claim a similar one for himself and with divine authorization claimed with it, right? So in both contexts, then, what I think what we can say is that, look, I have no problem saying that God chose Peter and Paul in a special way to minister to the Jews and to the Gentiles. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that.
Right.
Right.
So,
and
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say too, like when God says my chosen vessel, right, there is something exclusive and special about that, right? But
there.
Obviously that can't be to the exclusion of Peter. So for example, I could say, for instance, this is my chosen water bottle, right?
What did they?
Okay, why don't you just say what you wanted to say?
What did they just say in the objection about the keys versus the rod? Peter's keys were given objectively and divinely. Paul's rod was self-referred. Acts 9, Paul is the chosen vessel to preach to the Gentiles and the Jews. Who is saying that? Who's saying that, Geoff?
Say it again. I was just completely distracted by like your reaction on mute.
Acts chapter 9. Who
Peter
calls Jesus God's chosen vessel to preach to the Gentiles and the Jews? The Lord himself.
Right, yeah.
Acts chapter 15. Who says that Peter was the mouth by which the preaching of the Gentiles and Jews would be? Peter. Peter refers to his own authority, right?
Oh, so it's self,
yeah. That was self-referred. But Paul's authority was directly divinely given by the Lord himself. What did they just say about Paul's rod? Paul's rod was self-referred, so it's not the same as Peter's keys, which were divinely given. Bruh!
I'm just completely distracted by your reaction. Like you picked up on that before
do you see that? Do you see the significance of what
I
mentioned?
It's not consistent. They're not being consistent.
Oh my man. Okay. If you guys are watching, Suan, Trent, we love you guys. But me and Geoff love to have fun here, okay? So if we see an objection, if we see something that we particularly think can really, really be rebutted at, we're going to have some fun, okay? Love you guys. You're still awesome, still smart. But guys, come on. That is not consistent, okay? That's just not... Well, Peter refers to his own authority there, but Paul refers to his own rod, and that apparently doesn't count because it's self-referred. But Peter's self-reference counts.
We agree both of these arguments for a non-existent papacy of both the non-existent Pauline Papacy and the non-existent Petrine Papacy are both bad. So anyway, so it's not like we disagree with some of the critiques in general, but AWL comments, man, imagine if we said this to Papists about the Virgin Mary.
I think
is that the chosen vessel thing?
Oh yeah, 100%. If it was said about her, we wouldn't hear the end of it. Oh man, that was amazing. I knew they were going to go this route. I knew it.
What?
Right. And what I'm saying is that at this moment, I'm highlighting and forwarding this one. It has my authorization. It has my seal of approval.
Let me go back. This is important too.
God, something exclusive and special about that, right? But it says my chosen vessel saying that.
Right.
Right.
So,
and
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say too, like when God says my chosen vessel, right? There is something exclusive and special about that, right? But, obviously that can't be to the exclusion of Peter. So, for example, I could say,
you mean like the keys and the rest of the
for
apostles
instance,
who get the
this
keys
is my
later
chosen water bottle, right? And what I'm saying is that at this moment, I'm highlighting and forwarding this one. It has my authorization. It has my seal of
Matthew
approval.
16 verses 18,
Likewise,
man.
if God says, this is my chosen vessel, right? Well, he's emphasizing Paul and he's saying, this guy has my certification. That doesn't mean he's the only one with my certification, but it's a way of saying he is certified. Does that make sense? There's a difference.
Just do the same with every single Petrine text. Please do the same with every Petrine text.
They're kind of like Jason laid a trap like 10 to 20 years ago, and they just like stumbled on it and got their leg caught.
Bro, this is Jason's whole tactic just laid out to bear. They cannot be consistent with their standards. They can't. The only consistency they can have is the Pope said so, I believe it. It's true.
That's what Jason was trying to do, right?
Yeah.
Jason was trying to show you're being inconsistent, and then they have to be inconsistent. And now what I was saying is like it just occurred to me, didn't occur to me on first watch, was like, well, Matthew 16, he gets the keys, right? Peter gets the keys, and then Matthew 18, the rest of the apostles get the keys.
That's it.
It's like, couldn't you make the same argument and so Matthew 16 is not a
That's
papacy proof text?
That's it. They have just vindicated. Wow, they have just vindicated every Protestant argument. And I can imagine the one thing that could probably push back on is that, oh well, in Luke 22 there is an explicit singling out of Peter in a special way, not simply because he's being referenced at the moment, because Satan wants to sift you, plural, like wheat, but I pray for you, singular, Peter, that your faith won't fail. And of course, as we explained, look at the context, doesn't mean primacy. But either way, it's just not the same standards. Just, oh my word, wow. This is amazing. Absolutely amazing. Anyway,
it's a Calvinist proof text that praying for Peter.
That's it. Yeah, it's a Calvinist proof text, confirmed. Same with John 6. Anyway,
difference between saying, "Hey, this is my chosen vessel, and it's only him," versus what I think God is saying here is, "Yeah, Paul is my authorized vessel, right? He has my certification." But right, being the chosen vessel isn't just a singular, exclusive position.
Yeah, he has a stamp of approval for a prophetic mission. That all that verse is saying is that Paul was given a prophetic mission. And we see in Acts 15, Peter was given.
I distinctly remember either Trent Horn, Suan, Sonna, or potentially both appealing to Peter saying in Acts 15 that God said that by my mouth the Gentiles are here as some kind of proof text for Petrine primacy. I swear either of them, or potentially both, have raised that. And whether they did or didn't, all we literally need to do is just swap out everything they said, swap out Paul for Peter. And the exact same thing applies. It's breathtaking. It's actually incredible, the inconsistency.
It's like they see the trap and then they just walk right into it. I don't understand.
Honestly, with how casually they're saying this, I don't think they even see the trap. I really don't. they
It's like
pathetic mission.
This was the point of the article for you to, and then you're like, them taking it seriously means they didn't understand the article, I think.
That's it.
So what they should have spent the whole video just saying like why it's consistent to do Peter. I guess they are trying to do that. I don't know. But then by trying to do that, they kind of prove Jason correct.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. Also briefly, apologies people, but I won't be able to do a Q&A tonight just because it's really late and I actually do have work in the morning. So
I got to get to work.
Myself. That's it. Wage slavery, let's go.
Yeah,
John the Baptist.
If you have to work to feed yourself, then it's slavery.
No,
if things don't magically appear in like a Star Trek machine where you just get food,
I can't just dole off the bludge all my life. I can't just bludge off the dole all my life. Come on, man. Really?
Language is used to describe him. That the church, will always have every baptized person is called to be priest, prophet, and king. And so there are going to be multiple prophetic missions. And of course, each apostle and their successor has, juridical authority within the church. But it doesn't mean that there isn't someone.
Do we have any successor to any other apostle besides Peter? Like in a particular jurisdiction?
Apostolic
succession has to come through the papacy, right?
Well, I think they'd say that there was apostolic succession from all the apostles. I think they'd say that.
Okay, I'm just wondering. It's amorphous, I think.
Yeah, they would say it. It was just that those who succeeded
I don't
Peter
think you can say, blah, 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 blah. I guess you could say some cities where like Mark founded Alexandria or something like that.
Yeah, that's it. That would be the traditional thing that the Alexandrine churches. Well, that's kind of tricky because Mark wasn't like an apostle and all that. So, well, Ephesus would be traditionally considered a Pauline city. But anyway.
Who's given supremacy or primacy.
Right.
That language is more about, you're right, the prophetic mission, which is something that's shared amongst different people. It's not exclusive.
Yeah, and so at this point...
And as I argue, the prophetic mission is actually itself one-to-one identical with the apostolic authority, which is very important because it demonstrates that there isn't really this separate category of infallibility that isn't revelatory, and so demonstrates that the whole Roman claim of infallibility without revelation is, even if we grant it's consistent, it's very much unprecedented and not referenced in Scripture. But then it also likewise shows all the apostles have revelatory power. It's not like there's like an uber prophet who has more special revelation than the others. So, yeah. Anyway.
Too, I just want to say that, like, obviously none of these kind of Pauline primacy texts contradict, Roman Catholic belief.
Right.
The other thing I want to mention too is just
they would if they were true.
Consistent.
So and if they're consistent with the parallel Petrine text. Anyway.
It's a distinction, and this will be helpful as we go into these last 2 points. Mm-hmm. So I want to distinguish between objective versus subjective authority, right? So objective authority is an instance where someone has authority independent of, let's say, the approval of the people or their charisma, right? So for instance, let's say that, Trent, you and I are brothers, right? And you're my older brother. And, let's say dad leaves you behind as the one in charge. Mm-hmm. So objectively speaking, no matter what I say, I can't change the fact that you were given this authority over me, right? So in that sense, that's an objective authority. Well, let's suppose that I'm the more vocal younger brother, right? I'm very intelligent. I'm very witty. I know how to run and manipulate, and I know how to do all these things, right? I am very skilled. Well, in some sense, some people might say, oh, well, Suan has greater authority, right? Because he's the one who's more vocal, right? And so this is subjective or received authority.
He's the one who always gets what he wants.
Right. And so, but for instance, if you assert your objective authority that was given to you by dad, then that would actually count for something, right? And so what we're looking for here is, I think we have good evidence, especially with the Petrine primacy text that I've introduced and that we've talked about, where Peter has an objective handed down authority from Christ, a primacy given over all the other apostles. Whereas I think Paul has great subjective authority. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have authorized authority or he doesn't have objective authority from God, right? But that it's not at the same kind of level as Peter or even above Peter, right? But he does have a great subjective authority by virtue of his great charisma and calling to the gospel.
All right, number 5.
Okay, and this is the whole. It's basically it's kind of a slightly weirdly worded way of saying de jure versus de facto authority. So de jure, official position; de facto, what's the actual on the ground situation? And yet again, they prove the article's point again, because we could just say we could just flip it. Why can't we simply say that these instances, which rely on multiple layers of interpretation, so the Garden of Gethsemane episode, Jesus praying for Peter, why can't we just simply refer to those, and the Council of Jerusalem itself? Why can't we just simply say the exact same thing? If equally clear, if not more explicit passages for Paul can just be interpreted as him exerting a greater de facto authority, why can't we say the same for Peter? Natural leadership.
Why can't we say that when we were saying Peter was a natural leader, they keep referencing the first 12 chapters of Acts. That's a perfectly valid explanation for that without Peter being above the other apostles in any official way.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing really contradicts that. The only quite literally the only explicit text they have to go on is the Matthew 16 one. And then, of course, the other apostles get the binding and loosing, and just the ways they try to preserve primacy of Peter is just, it's amazing. Yajun Yuan, good to see ya. Good to see you here. Is response covering the whole entire video? Yes, it is. Anyway,
if we can get through it.
If we can, yeah. Let's go.
So number 5 is Paul is the only apostle who refers to his authority over all the churches, right? And it's like, okay, well, so let me just actually include the scriptures. So 1 Corinthians 4:17, 7:17, and then 2 Corinthians 11:28, right? I mean, so the first problem with this is, okay, even if Paul's the only one who refers to his authority over all the churches, so what, right? I mean, all the apostles have authority over the church, right? All of them have this kind of universal power, so to speak.
Yes.
And so I don't think that's necessarily problematic.
Yeah.
Now, I do want to include a nuance.
So when you say all of them has authority, that means like when Thomas preaches in India, it doesn't mean like he loses his status as an apostle if he goes back to Italy or something.
Right,
Yeah.
right. All of them have the status as being apostle no matter where they go.
Right.
Now, one argument that people will give, though, is that, hey, this type of language that Paul's using, this is like very papal language, right? So why doesn't, Peter talk this way or something like that? So I just want to include like a nuance that needs to be remembered here, right? So the apostles have a unique authority, right? Because they are the chief guardians of the deposit of the faith, right? Scripture and tradition. But not only that, I mean, one could argue that they are, in a sense, the deposit of the faith, especially Paul and Peter and the others who wrote epistles, right? So the apostolic deposit has universal authority over the church. And the apostles, being the chief guardians, they can have universal rule, right, through accessing that deposit and teaching definitively with it, right? So Paul has authority, not by virtue of being Paul, but by virtue of being an apostle. Now,
especially one inspired to write scripture.
Exactly.
Keep going.
The distinction, however,
now do Peter.
With Peter is that Peter does have authority by virtue of being an apostle. But the argument of Roman Catholics is that Peter has an authority by virtue of being Peter, right? So the authority that was given to Peter is a uniquely kind of Petrine authority. So, for example, when the Pope declares something ex cathedra, he's not declaring it as an apostle. What he's doing is he's declaring it, as it were, as if he were Peter, as he's in the chair of Peter. And so remember going back to Luke 22:31, where Peter is kind of the safeguard or the protector of the apostles, right? The apostles are the chief safeguard of the deposit of the faith. But who is the chief safeguard of the guardians? It's Peter.
Jesus.
Right.
So Peter has this dual role as not only an apostle, as a brother, but also as an elder brother and a protector. And so here, I don't think it's problematic at all that Paul claims to have this kind of universal authority to teach, right?
Okay, so this is something we'll kind of see. So I for one wouldn't give that precise kind of argument of, oh well, why doesn't Peter use the same kind of papal language? Perhaps there's a way you can do it in that kind of way, but rather it's kind of an odd response that Roman Catholic apologists will sometimes give, where it's like, oh well, but this is also the case here, so why can't we just interpret it for this case? So like the whole point of the Pauline parallels. But then they'll say, oh no, but we in our arguments we say this, and that. But the whole point is that we don't grant your assumptions. We don't grant your assumptions of these arguments.
Right.
So if I want to, so the whole point with appealing to Pauline papal universalist language is to simply say Paul does the exact same thing here. So why can't I just point to that and say Pauline primacy, with Paul talking about his rule over all the churches and all that jazz? Like, why not? And so they really, frankly, they can't come up with anything against that without, apart from just simply begging the question of their view. They have to assume the papacy. I mean, again, difference between compatible data versus actual evidence. Could you nuance the scriptures? Could you technically nuance the scriptures in a way like Paul's language to say to be in harmony with a papacy? I think it would be a very strong stretch at best. But let's say, for example, sure, you can do that. That would still leave you with the problem that data is not that it nullifies specific evidence you allege for your papacy to prefer it over others. It may not be a defeater necessarily, but it does nullify a special preference for your view.
Well, this is why I think you need to go to history, right, to kind of solve this issue. Is like, we don't see this in the early however many centuries, so it's not, we can tell this is not a valid argument. That's it. And I think it was something he said a little bit earlier, which I wanted
He's in the chair of Peter. And so remember going back to Luke 22:31, it as an apostle. But the argument of Roman Catholics is that Paul has authority, not by virtue of being Paul, but by virtue of being an apostle. Now,
really quickly, something I wanted to say.
So Paul has authority, not by virtue of being Paul, but by virtue of being an apostle. Now,
especially one inspired to write scripture.
Exactly.
Okay, now I think we responded to everything we needed to. So I'll just...
was the chief safeguard, dual role protector, seems to have this kind of faith, and he's saying, through this deposit I'm teaching, right? But then during the Gospel of Matthew, what Aquinas argues is that the apostles receive the keys of the kingdom and the power to bind and loose through Peter, right? So notice that Paul, when he teaches and he gives his authority, he's accessing the authority of the gospel, of the deposit of the faith, which Peter can do as well. But also the other apostles through Peter receive unique blessings, receive protection. And so that's where you can establish supremacy, by showing that Peter has authority qua or by virtue of being Peter, and that Peter is this chief protector of the apostles. The other thing I want to mention too, Trent, just really...
And that's the whole problem.
How is that? So he's given, one has it because he's in office, and Peter has it because of...
That's it. This is the common... It's the common tactic. Like, if you just grant our assumptions, we'll be right. But that's the whole problem. We don't grant your assumptions. We don't grant your assumptions of this distinction between Paul getting his authority qua apostle versus Peter getting his authority qua apostle plus qua Peter. We don't grant that assumption. Why should we grant that at all? Nothing in the text of Holy Scripture should grant that. Like if Jesus saying, "Oh, I give to you, Peter. Oh, look, that's him because he's Peter," and all that. But all the apostles are said to receive in their person, especially Paul, on numerous occasions, that he got authority. He's been commissioned. He, not simply this abstract office with which then he has some kind of license in and doesn't have in his person and all that. That's an arbitrary distinction which we do not grant. We just don't grant that distinction at all. So your case isn't made evident here at all. There is no fundamental difference between the universal teaching claims of Peter and those of Paul. There's none.
Quick is that, obviously Paul's letters predate the Gospels, right? But that actually stands to benefit the case for, Petrine primacy, because what the Gospels reflect is the early Christian communities, along with the eyewitness testimony, reflecting upon the legacy of Peter.
Right.
And so when you see these memories of Peter come out, these examples of his primacy and his importance, it's also the early Christian community remembering the legacy and the role of Peter. And so once again, I think that we need to remember that the Gospels represent kind of the summative thought of even the early Christians,
just
and their
raw assertions.
Right. These are the stories that survive, that were told more frequently, and were then highlighted in sharing the gospel.
Right. Okay, so here's my sixth and last one.
All right.
So it's Paul is the only apostle who publicly rebukes and corrects another apostle, and this is Galatians 2:11.
We already mentioned this, so.
And I actually had an article published on Catholic Answers on the day that we filmed this, which responds
objection number 4.
Objection.
All right. Well, I'll link to it. I'll link to it below then when the video airs.
Yeah. So I'll just say just a few things. The first thing is that what's going on in Galatians 2:11, right, is there's a situation where in Antioch, the Jewish, or I think it takes place in Antioch or in Jerusalem, but regardless, the emissaries of James, they come, right? They're the circumcision faction. This is generally regarded as occurring after the Acts 15 council, where they declared that, Gentiles don't have to be circumcised.
I'm not sure.
And Peter, when he's confronted by the emissaries of James for dining with Gentile Christians, Peter ends up kind of chickening out, right? And he moves away. And then this causes a scandal. And then eventually, Paul is super upset because he's saying that he's the chief minister. Paul is the chief minister to the Gentiles. And he points out that, Barnabas and the other Jewish Christians follow Peter's lead, right, when he does this. So the first thing that I want to point out is that this is not rebuking Peter for false teaching.
Right.
Okay, so this doesn't fall under papal infallibility. He's pointing out a moral fault in Peter for chickening out. Right. The second thing that I want to point out too is it's kind of telling how, some people will say that, after, let's say, the first 12 chapters of Acts, Peter kind of loses importance, right? Or maybe he returns in Acts 15, but his influence is, that's it, right? Well, this would occur after Acts 15. And in this example, what happens is Peter right? He does a simple action of not dining with Gentile Christians, and that causes the Jewish Christians and Barnabas to actually choose follow the lead of Peter over a council. That's significant.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Right. And then even the other point to point out too is
he had scandalized them through inaction that he may not have even intended.
Right. I mean, the other thing to point out too is that Barnabas was also Paul's right-hand man, right? I mean, he's there with him throughout the stories. He's there being a minister to the Gentiles. He's there in Acts 15 alongside Paul, you know, speaking at the Jerusalem council. But here, you know, Paul doesn't actually directly rebuke Barnabas. He focuses his rebuke on Peter because he recognizes that it's really Peter whose kind of example here has the most sway, right? So that's the second point. The third and last point I want to just say here is that despite all of that has been said so far, I don't think it's been demonstrated that there's an objective, divinely instituted hierarchy of Paul over Peter, or even of Paul being equal to Peter, right? I think certainly there are examples of Paul's importance, of his boldness in preaching the gospel.
Can we pause
right?
here?
But when we look at the whole synopsis,
because now they're going into summary mode. We've said it before. Like, there's a lot to be said about the Paul rebuking Peter, but it's just like if you swapped roles, we would have been hearing about this for a couple millennia now.
Yeah, it's that. Yet again, they're willing to go to a great level of nuancing and depth. Even to the point of the whole debate of whether Galatians was written before or after the Acts 15 council. I don't think there is a general... I haven't surveyed, but as far as I'm aware, I don't think there is a general opinion. I think there are like quite a diversity of people who say before or after. But either way, even to go to that level of depth to try and add something to the argument, as well as all the nuances of the circumstances surrounding the whole situation, going after every little bit of it to account for it to get an accurate picture, that's awesome. That's great. We fundamentally agree with in many respects of what they're saying here, except when they try to draw any little crumb of authority, like, oh, people followed Peter's lead anyway, like whatever. But point being, just do the same with Luke 22. Do the same with the garden at Gethsemane. Don't just go, oh, look, Jesus praying specifically for Peter, therefore federal primacy. Or, hey, look, Jesus specifically criticizing Peter with the sleeping apostles, therefore federal headship primacy. That's just like, can you do the same level of nuance with those passages? Like, please? I mean, it's just demonstrating the whole article's point time and time again. You got anything else, or?
No, it's just more of the hammer problem or the Peter syndrome.
Pretty much. I think you know what? I think I may have a little bit of time for like a short Q&A.
You want to just get into that? Let's do that.
Yeah,
now.
sure. I think they're pretty much done.
They're done.
Yeah, I think they're pretty much done now. So, people, let us do a brief.
I got about 10 minutes.
Yeah, and then we'll have a very brief Q&A. And so, if you're a supporter, you will have a particular advantage here because supporter and super chats are prioritized. Financial supporters from Subscribestar. And if you're from Subscribestar, I highly recommend that you send your question in the supporter questions channel on the Discord if you're there, so that I can separate it from other questions in the general chat. But otherwise, even if you message in the general chat, I'll still try to pick you out, apart from others. I'll scroll from some questions people might have given before, during.
I don't think anyone has any serious questions because it's kind of like it was a joke.
I think we demonstrated ourselves pretty well.
No, and it's just like it was a joke that they, they didn't get the gist of it. They needed to respond in a different way. It's like, well, no, this is how we're not being selective or having an unequal standard. And then they kind of showed in the middle of it that they were using unequal standards.
I think at points they're trying to do that to show how, hey, look, this is why we're not. But even then, they really quickly switch back to just general criticisms of the parallels themselves and not getting the point that the same can be leveled against their own proof texts. So, yeah, it's a great job, Jason Engwer, for really making a good trap. really making a good one. I mean, hey, potentially, maybe it could inspire from myself one day, maybe an even more refined list that gets more particular nuance that could really set an even bigger trap. Either way, So no supporter questions I see. So we'll just look at this first one by YVF. Will you be reviewing Eric Ibarra's new book on justification? Yalla habibi, yalla kaz walla. Maybe.
Does it break any new ground? Have we heard anything?
So from what it looks like, it's pretty much a systematic going through of Romans, and it looks pretty in depth and all that. So pretty decent, meaty tome. So
I would like to see how he does the anticipated objection in Romans 6.
Yeah, I'll be really curious about that too.
Relative to what you found his comment in the call to communion when he was a Protestant. So.
Yeah, that was beautiful, very beautiful.
Because he was right.
Maybe I will. Yeah, he was right. Yeah, maybe I will. I think next pay I might pick up the book, take a look at it.
Why don't we submit to Antioch? Question.
Yeah. So if Petrine supremacy is true, why not submit to Antioch? It's like it's so funny because they rely so much on like the significance of like the order of things happening. So like, for example, Peter being mentioned first, protos, they interpret that as, oh, look, it means first and chief and therefore Petrine primacy. Well, why not just apply that same significance of order to the fact that Peter was first over Antioch and then Rome? Why? That does not make the most logical sense of appealing to that. But then, of course, they'll apply it to the later church standard of, oh, look, his relics were buried in Rome, therefore Roman.
I would still say, why don't you actually evangelize Jews?
Yeah, there's that too. There is that. Yeah.
I'm not talking about the trads or whatever. I'm talking about like the actual papacy.
That's it. Still no supporter questions. The Theology Zone. Have you guys heard the book Not by Scripture Alone by Mormon author Robert S. Boylan? I have heard of that, yes, and I have seen him. I think he's the guy who does the blog Scriptural Mormonism. I have heard of it, yeah. And I haven't looked at it. I don't know if there's anything significant about it. All I remember is that in the debate of those Mormons versus the Reform guys, the recent one at Apologetic Church, how the Mormons basically read Catholic answers and used that for their arguments. So it was a pretty funny watch. So I very much suspect that Robert Boylan does the same thing. And I do think I've even read his comments in Sola Scriptura elsewhere, and they did very much mirror Romanist apologetics. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was basically the same. Yeah. So here's a supporter question. The other Philip, if order really matters, then why isn't Mary the first pope? I mean, I guess.
Well, I guess they would argue it has to be a male.
Yeah, so the legitimate nuances we can grant. So we don't have to exactly just go.
I would say she's not. You can tell she's not the mother of the church or consider the mother of all Christians because she would at least be mentioned once by name in a epistle.
Yeah, and it's genuinely bizarre that Paul in Romans, for example, who relies so darn heavily on a Jesus Adam typology, why he wouldn't reference Mary Eve typology like Irenaeus does if he believed even 10% of what Rome does on Mary. Like, it's just the coping behind that is unbelievable.
That's we're using arguments for silence, I know, but I think it's silence that
there's valid silences. Like you have to believe that there are valid silences in order to do any historical investigation of change. Otherwise, if there wasn't any such thing as a good valid argument from science, then you can't assess change in history at all. Unironically, are Catholics Christians? I mean, in the normative sense of the word, I guess so, yeah.
If they reject the Council of Trent on justification, sure.
Yeah. If we're talking about the sense, though, of actually, do they have a saving faith? Normatively, no, they don't. I have hope that many Romanists are ignorant enough of their beliefs that they may just get in. And I'm even more hopeful for Eastern Orthodox, honestly, because Eastern Orthodoxy is so thoroughly confused with what they themselves believe about justification that I think many of them, without realizing it, just waddle on straight on into sola fide. So I'm more hopeful for many Orthodox, with the exception, of course, of the westernized Orthobros who are basically repackaged Roman apologists. So yeah, there's that. Philip, you need to use this methodology to prove Marian supremacy. She was chosen by God. The mother of the church was perfect. How could they argue back? I mean, I guess if you want to argue that there was a dual succession line from Peter and from Mary. YVF, what is your favorite commentary on Romans? Bloody good question, that. To be perfectly honest, I do not read too many commentaries super often. I don't have a lot of them.
I don't have the money.
Yeah, I'm more
the
of a
excerpts
Primacy
I've seen from Douglas Moo are good, and
Yeah,
I basically use like ones that are copyright free at this point. So I
Pretty
usually my go-to is Calvin.
My yeah, I'd have to agree. Like I've read sections in that of Moo's, and his is like stupidly massive and thorough. I think he did the second edition in 2018. I think so. It's very recent, very
his
big.
excursus on it's on the Internet Archive. It's out. It's the dead link now, but his excursus on works of the law, handling new perspective and all is really good.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. And
in
actually, speaking of new perspective, I highly recommend a book called "Cracking the Foundation of the New Perspective on Paul," which basically goes through like a ton of Second Temple texts.
Can you send me a link later?
Yeah, we'll do. It basically goes through a bunch of Second Temple texts in order to argue that actually there was such a view as works righteousness, not simply the new perspective thing where it's like, oh, well, it's just, well, I forgot exactly how they articulated it.
Oh, well, I always felt the problem was that they kind of didn't realize the nuance in the Reformation, where the Reformation, because it's the typical like, oh, they mentioned grace, so
yeah, that's it.
Everything's fine, and then they weren't like the Roman Catholics who were ranked Pelagians. I was like, well, the Reformers
book does very well show that there was such things as works righteousness, contra the new perspective.
Well, they didn't understand that. They don't understand the Reformation
nuance, yeah.
So they don't understand like
that's
the Reformation.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, no one's arguing. No one who knows their stuff is arguing that Rome denies or that anyone denied that grace was necessary. It's that if it's sufficient.
I've gone up to Jehovah's Witnesses. They maintain grace. It's like everybody affirms grace. That's
bloody like, Mormons affirm grace. Like, come on. You need to use I just picked up Roman's commentary from Sproul Ligonier. There you go. That's pretty cool.
Making fun of me for my pronunciation. You can't get R.C. Sproul right.
Yeah, tomatoes. Do Suan and Trent have a material sufficiency view of scripture, or are they part and part?
I forgot if I asked Trent this. I think he might be part.
I think he's part and part him. I think Trent. I think he mentioned he went back and forth on this. I think he's part and part him right now. I think.
Well, then we have to ask him. Who is your guest? Colin, Pastor Colin.
Colin. Wait. Well, I've had many guests, but
well, the guy from Roswell. You have a clip. You clipped it where he has like a material sufficiency kind of like if they take partum, how do they handle 2 Timothy 3? And if they have, and if they do hold a material sufficiency,
that's book.
How do you get the basically the canon conundrum? You can turn back on them.
That's it.
But,
yeah, that's it.
Someone asked previously, what does my hat mean? It's for the Philadelphia Phillies, my local baseball team.
Classic. Okay, would it be hypothetically possible that Rome could push for Mary to be a priestess, given what they call a mediatrix? They couldn't do that. Their thing of masculine only hierarchy, which is a good thing. It's too firmly entrenched. So yeah, I think that'll be all for now. I do really.
Yeah, I gotta get going. Thanks for inviting me on.
This was excellent. Excellent collabing with you as usual, Geoff. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you everybody for watching. If you haven't already, like, subscribe, turn on notifications, follow my other social media, especially Gab and Odyssey, which are the alternatives should I get nuked one day from YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, all that jazz. And if you are financially stable and are contributing to your church, whether financially or through manpower, and you want to support my mission, become a supporter and subscribe star down below right now. It is awesome helping me making this into a job. Thank you very much. And Geoff's cat, I assume, says goodbye as well.
Yeah, bye. Give me treats,
Thank
is what he's saying.
Very much for coming along. I hope you have a lovely day. God bless.